Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm delighted to present a virtual sit-down with New York Times bestselling author Lisa Unger. Coincidentally, or not, we once met when we both happened to be in Key West at the same time, so this seems a bit like destiny, no? But I digress. Lisa is the author of 18 critically acclaimed novels. She burst onto the scene with Beautiful Lies in 2006 and has been a mainstay ever since. Her books have reached millions of readers around the world and are now available in 26 languages. Widely regarded as a master of suspense, Lisa's work has been voted Best of the Year or Top Picks by The Today Show, Good Morning America, Entertainment Weekly, Amazon, and IndieBound, and her most recent novel, The Stranger Inside, was named a Best Book by People Magazine, The Boston Globe, Kirkus, and BookBub. Her next full-length release, Confessions on the 745, about a woman whose once perfect life is upended after a chance encounter with a stranger on a train, isn't due out until October, but has already received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Booklist. Woo woo! In the meantime, you can check out Letter B, one of 6 shorts featured in the new Amazon Original Stories collection Hush, available digitally and on audio July 30th. Here's the elevator pitch. Will, an aspiring novelist, can't stop parsing his ex-girlfriend's popular social media accounts for clues that her ideal new rural life with the perfect man has a dark side. After all, nobody he knows has actually seen the blissful blogger in the flesh for nearly a year. When Will draws a wary friend into this investigation, the real question becomes who's truly in danger. Okay, my peeps, sit back, relax, and let Lisa Unger tell you her tale. But be forewarned, your TBR pile's probably going to grow.
Good morning, everybody. I am really happy to be in conversation with Lisa Unger today. She is the author of Let Her Be, which is a new short story in the Hush collection from Amazon, which publishes on July 30th. So good morning, Lisa. Thanks so much for visiting me virtually today.
Good morning, John. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So I thought I would start by asking you a little bit about your new short story, Let Her Be. Great title, by the way. And sort of the theme of this collection seems to be truth and the distortion of truth, and oftentimes how the lens of social media lends itself to that. So can you talk to how that was sort of a jumping off point for your story?
Yeah. So John Santalofer, who's a friend of mine, I think he was the original person that came up with this idea of the end of truth. How suddenly, because of the way we're living online, even before all of this madness, there is like sort of this curated version of everybody's life. And, the idea of what is true and what is not true in a lot of different senses has just been eroding. And so that, of course, for me, as somebody who, is sort of obsessed with psychology and the human mind and the human psyche and how we relate to each other and how we're formed, this for me was very exciting as a jumping off point for a short story. So I just had this kind of idea in my head and this thought in my head, and I just I have a lot of thoughts and observations which I think come through my work about social media and how we use it to sort of broadcast ourselves in this weird way. So that was really the jumping off point that got me thinking about the story Let Her Be.
Sure. And it's kind of funny because you say that, and we are living in, a digital world.
I know.
And I was
it was bad before.
Even more so. It's so bizarre. And it's like, on the one hand, you sort of have to step away from it, and then you find yourself in a pandemic and you realize, well, that's really what's sort of connecting you to people. So how do you moderate it?
Yeah.
I was talking to a counselor who works with teens, and she does a lot of work with anxiety, and she was talking about how you really need to disconnect, which is not easy to do these days. And how either you feel the exhaustion of living up to the image that you've created online, or you feel bad because you see this image of somebody else and you feel like you yourself don't live up to that. I'm like, online is just the highlight reel. We're all living like the unscripted, unedited reality. And then we put our cropped, filtered pictures online. But there's actually a really great line from the story that I wanted to pull out just because I think it sort of symbolizes that. You have the mother of a character who's gone missing, and she's speaking on the phone to these two people who are trying to track her daughter down. And she says, she lives online like all of you kids. You think that's the real world, but it isn't. And I thought that just kind of sums it up really beautifully. But so basically, I guess, a real quick snapshot of the story is it's centered around a man named Will, and he is recovering from a suicide attempt. And, he had a bad end to a relationship with a woman named, you tell me, is it Anissa or Anissa? Because otherwise,
Anissa, yeah.
And so, things didn't end very well for either of them. And, she just leaves her old life behind. And he decides that maybe he needs to track her down to make sure that she's doing okay. But I did want to ask you first, Will being a survivor of suicide, what was your process like to both, understand and honor the act and the recovery? Because that's a big part of the story. And I'm sure it included a lot of, research into therapy and psychology as well.
Yeah, I mean, research into therapy and psychology and psychiatry and like sort of like the psycho-spiritual union of like development and what forms us and mental illness, like this is sort of my area. So this is the kind of thing that I read and research all the time. And it is extremely important to me that, in the portrayal of, certain types of mental illness, for lack of a better word, or depression, or in this case, depression that leads to suicide, that I handle it with respect and with dignity. I think we're all struggling with our different mental challenges. We all have our issues and our isms. And I think that if you, if you approach your characters with compassion and you actually do the research about how people metabolize their depression, how they come to a decision about suicide, how they come to a decision to decide to survive afterwards, I think if you approach that research and those people, because I do really feel that my characters are real people living in my mind. I feel like if you approach that with empathy and compassion, you can draw an authentic portrayal of something that maybe you personally don't experience. And so that's what I try to do. That's what I tried to do with Will and, sort of with all of my characters.
Yeah, I was going to say, people who've read you will not be surprised. That is sort of your thing, which is great. And I wanted to just expand on that a little bit, because I think that something you do really, really beautifully, which some people struggle with, is, balancing sort of an internal life and internal dialogue with action. Because a lot of the story is spent, in Will's head and in his mind, but there's never a loss of narrative momentum. So can you talk a little bit about how you, attempt to balance those elements in your stories?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that, for me, character is king, right? And, I could easily dwell inside my characters and in their minds and their internal thought process, like, just pretty much exclusively. So left to my own devices, that's probably what I would be doing. But, when you're writing a story, it has to have a certain kind of momentum. And that, the basic premise of, I think, any novel, but most especially thrillers, is there always has to be movement. The internal life always has to be sort of, scaffolded by the action of the character. And, I'm always very rooted in character. It's not so much, like, it's never the plot that comes to me. It's never the idea for the story that exists first. And I'm just trying to move my little character pieces through this story that I've created. It's always the character voice. And part of what they're doing is what reveals their character. So if I can stay in that space where I'm in their internal life, but I'm also exploring them through their action, in the story, then, I can keep myself interested, as well as, keep the momentum of the, the thriller keep that momentum going for my reader. So it's kind of like a union. Like I know that, I know what the reader wants, I know what I want, so I try to find a way to give us both, what we're looking for.
Sure. Well, you do it well because I've read a lot of your stuff, and it's a fine balancing act because you know when it works and you know when it doesn't work. But it works for you. So I did want to ask you, on the other hand, in addition to all the internalization that's happening in this story, there's also another character, Emily, who is one of Anissa's best friends, and she was a good friend to Will as well. And so they sort of connect. One, because she has some connections in the publishing industry, and he's a struggling writer, and I think we'll maybe talk a little bit more about that later. But
Yeah.
in addition to that, they both miss Anissa because she's really sort of just left everything behind, started a new life in a small house, and the only way people really see her is through her Instagram account and the pictures that she posts of her life. And they have Will and Emily have a really interesting dynamic, and they sort of feed off of each other in what they think that Instagram account represents. So can you just talk a little bit about their dynamic and how that propels the story forward?
Yeah, I was very interested in that kind of dynamic because, like, I just see Emily as this, like, sort of almost like very romantic, like, kind of writer figure, and I sort of see her as that, like, that friend and this very, like, powerful relationship that Will and Anissa had, or maybe they had. At least Will thinks that they had this incredibly intense and powerful relationship. And that and that she may or may not have had, Emily may or may not have, during, this kind of lovely little threesome, had a crush on Will. And so now that, the worst things have happened, he's had this hideous breakup, he's sunk into depression, and then, tried to kill himself. And now he's coming back up for air. And so here's Emily, who is, the energy of her, I think, in that moment is maybe just kind of hopeful. Like, she's had these sort of aspirations to Will, and maybe this is her moment. So, and I don't know, for Will, like, I think he's so myopic in this moment. When we first meet him, he's so involved in his own pain, and he sort of is giving lip service to his his psychiatrist and his move back towards the new normal. But his connection to Emily, I'm not sure whether there's an attraction there, or whether it's just he sees her as this kind of connection to Anissa, and that maybe with their combined energy he can find answers to these questions that he has about where did she go, why did she leave everyone, why has no one ever really seen this guy that she's with, why has nobody heard from her or seen her in the flesh since she went out to become, and I guess we would call it, an Instagram influencer, yogi, and meditation guru. So I think that she wants something from him, and he certainly wants something from her, but it's definitely not the same thing.
Sure. And all those questions you just listed a moment ago too. Readers, if you read the story, you will find out the answers, because we're certainly not going to discuss them right now. I think that was a good little teaser of where the story is headed. So I'm going to sort of move away from the specifics of that because I don't want to spoil anything. But I did want to ask you, much of the story is set in New York City. Obviously you're in Florida now, but you've had quite extensive experience in New York, and I've been there occasionally, and it really does sort of have an energy and an air to it that's unlike anywhere else. And usually, it's exhilarating to be there, and then I always find myself exhausted, like, whew, can't wait to get back on the train because I don't know if I can keep up with that pace. But I really sort of felt nostalgic for the city because things have changed so much, but there really are a couple passages that just sort of, capture all of that energy. And I was wondering if you could just speak briefly to New York and what makes it special, because it is really unlike anywhere else.
Oh yeah, it is. And I've sort of had like a lifelong love affair with New York City. My aunt, my favorite aunt lived on Park Avenue, and she was like a buyer for Gucci. And so it always seemed like to me as a kid, like this incredibly glamorous place. I traveled a lot during my young childhood. My dad worked for Exxon, so we were living in the Netherlands and the UK, and then when we finally came back, we lived in with my grandmother for a while in Brooklyn, and so that has always just kind of felt like home to me. Like New York has always felt like home, and what I love about New York City, or what I've always loved about it, is how every different neighborhood and borough has its own like sort of energy sphere. And that, whether you're like my dad is like sort of Brooklyn born and raised, so there's like this Brooklyn Italian energy that, for me is like super familiar. And then of course I went to college in New York City. I went to NYU, and then I went to Eugene Lang College, which is part of the New School. And so I lived there for 13 years, and I worked in publishing. And so during that time, I probably lived and or worked in every single neighborhood in New York City, from Riverdale and the Bronx to Brooklyn Heights to the East Village. So it's just, in many ways, it's the place that I know the best. And I can, if I close my eyes, I can hear it, I can smell it, I can sense it. And when I'm there, I'm somebody else. Like it just kind of like, it's a different energy for me. Like it connects me to a different layer of myself. But like you say, it is also quite exhausting. Especially after having lived in Florida for, like basically on the beach for the last 20 years, there's a certain peace and quiet to that lifestyle that is more conducive to writing than, living in New York City might be.
Oh yeah, I feel like anytime, I've gone in for a couple days here and there for BEA or for Thriller Fest or whatever,
Yeah.
and especially on the occasions, if I've stayed over for a night or two, I come home and I'm like, Chelsea, I need to be in recovery for like a couple days because that just wiped
Yeah.
me out. Like, people don't stop
They
moving.
do not. And you kind of feel like I need a sensory deprivation tank or something after you've been in the city for a couple days. But, prior to this, obviously, I'm back there all the time. I still have a lot of family and friends there. Obviously, my publisher, my agent, everyone is there. So I'm there, multiple times a year. So I still sort of stay connected to that, world and, to myself when I'm in that space.
Sure, sure. And well, you rendered it really well on the page because I know it's, just a couple short passages here and there, but I really felt like I was in it again, which was, kind of nice, especially now when you might not be able to get there. But I did want to ask you, yeah, sort of the obvious question that I have to ask because people also know you as a novelist. I think you have 18 novels to your credit now or something like that. But you've written lots of short stories too. So can you talk a little bit about the process of writing a short story and how that differs from writing a longer work and whether or not you have a preference between the two?
Yeah, I very recently fell in love with the form of the short story. I have always sort of considered the novel to be my form, like that's my voice. Although I have written short stories prior to the last couple of years, but starting with the Sleep Tight Motel, I really just kind of fell in love with this form, and I find it to be, um, it's weird that it's sort of a unique way to dive into character. It's shorter, obviously, than a novel, although my short stories tend to be kind of on the long side. I have yet to write a short story that's like under 60 pages or something like that. But like it's almost like this little terrarium, right? Like you have this like small space in which you can create a tiny universe, of very intense character and, and plot movement and, energy, right? So it's like this really tiny little space where you can just expand. And I don't, the novel is this long, relationship. It's a year usually of sort of fits and starts, good days, bad days, like just kind of, all the layers of a relationship that you would have with anyone or anything, right? But a short story for me tends to be a very like just sort of manic burst of energy. And so I just have fallen in love with it in the last couple of years, and have written quite a few short stories. So actually there'll be two others that come out this year. There'll be one in an anthology called Tampa Bay Noir, and another one in the MWA anthology at the end of the year.
Oh, nice. So just more deadlines for you, but at least
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's fine. I just endless deadlines. Yeah, it's okay.
All right. Well, I do want to ask you too, we've been talking a little bit about social media and appearances versus reality. And I just wonder, what is your relationship like with social media? Because you as an author now really have to have a platform. So regardless of whether or not people are comfortable with it, you're sort of expected to embrace it. So can you speak to your experiences a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's taken me a long time to find my voice in social media. I did not come to it easily. To me, like sort of the surface of things is the least interesting. Like I'm not interested in what I see on your feed. Like I'm interested in why you posted it.
Yeah.
Right. Like so I do not come easily to social media, because to me it seems like, sort of the ultimate, it's like almost like a bulletin board of yourself. Like you're only posting like the most perfect, like you said, cropped and filtered images of yourself. You're sort of like tossed off tweets or whatever. It probably took you like an hour to figure out how to say it right or whatever, and so I really do consider it to be extremely inauthentic, and in that way to be very stressful for me. Like when something is not what it seems to be, like my brain kind of goes into overdrive. Sure. Trying to figure out, wait, this does not work, this is not right, what's happening underneath, where's the shadow, right? Like that sort of my Jungian, like, drive, right? Like I want to know, like I see what you're putting up there, but I want to know, I want to know the real deal. But then that said, it is kind of something that you wind up having to do. So I really worked to find my authenticity within this inauthentic format. In a lot of ways, the Zoom videos and stuff, the things that I've been doing with Three Good Things, like that's definitely my authentic self, where I just want to kind of connect with somebody and find out what's making them happy in a time where everything else is making everybody extremely unhappy. So like, that's kind of my instinct is to counteract negativity. So that's what I try to do with those, with the videos. And then, it is a way for me to stay connected to readers, especially now, to stay connected to my author friends. I have this like sort of, beloved community of author pals, and, we kind of sort of bolster each other and help each other through. So this is kind of the way of doing that. And, and yes, of course, it's the way that I disseminate information, like things that, people need to know about. This is on sale and this great review and, all of that. So I have really worked to find an authentic voice for social media. And it sort of requires me to kind of follow my, like I'm not good at like, okay, you have to do this on Mondays, you have to do this on Tuesdays, you have to like this whole like idea that you have to schedule and be consistent. Like I can't operate that way. I have to operate from, a place of like, I'm excited about this, I want to share this. So that's what I try to do. So try to create a union between the authentic and the inauthentic.
No, that's great. And I'm glad you mentioned Three Good Things because I was going to ask you about that. It is such a fun show. So if you haven't checked it out, you really should because you get to, meet a whole host of different authors, but it's not the typical interview, which is really, really great. Yes, you talk about their books, but I mean, also all the things that make them happy. And sometimes you get recipes. And like I was telling you
Yeah.
before we started recording, like if you're a person like me and you like to see what's on somebody's bookshelf, like you can spend 15, 20 minutes just staring over Lisa's shoulder and looking at all of those books.
There's a lot of books back there. I should have, so there's my books. I should have those. Somebody told me, she's like, you need to have your books more prominently displayed. I'm like, you're right, I do, but I haven't gotten around to doing that.
But that's all right. Now we know that they're there. But yeah, it's a fun show.
Sure,
Do you have time just for a couple more questions?
of course.
All right, awesome. So I did just want to take you back in time a little bit because, you have a really interesting origin story and you knew from a very young age that being a writer, that was all you wanted to do. And finally you reached a place after, having been educated, having worked in the publishing industry, you said now is the time. I either have to do it or I know that I'm going to look back and regret that I didn't do it. So can you just talk about making that transition and what in your mind knew that this is who you were and what you needed to be?
Yeah, so I've always been a writer. I never thought of myself any other way. It was just, it was always the place where I most naturally felt at home. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that we traveled a lot as a kid. So I was always on the outside looking in. I was always like the new kid somewhere. And so but I could always be at home, like in a book, a book that I was reading or in a story that I was writing. So that was always just how I defined myself. And, I kind of was like, I wondered if I could do it, like if it was something that I could do. And, my dad, who was an engineer, was basically like, yeah, no, you can't do that. It's not that's not a job.
Prove him wrong.
It's great that you can, string a few coherent sentences together, but you need to go to work when you graduate from college. And my mom was a librarian and a great lover of story. And she knew I was a writer and she was like, but she also wanted me to get a job. She was like, no one thought I come from Brooklyn Italian and my mom is like Irish. They're like immigrant families. It's like, we don't spend a lot of time dreaming. We spend a lot of time working.
Yeah.
Kind of the epic, right? And so, after I graduated from college, I went into publishing. My whole education was completely focused on writing. I mean, I really wasn't writing and reading, like between poetry and journalism and the novel and the screenplay and all that. So I had some amazing teachers, and but when I graduated, I kind of thought, well, I just didn't have the confidence to pursue that. So I just went into publishing, which was like the closest thing I could do to following my dreams without really following my dreams. And then, unfortunately, I was really good at my job, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the time I spent writing got smaller and smaller and smaller until, I just had this moment where I realized everything about my life was wrong, that I was in the wrong relationship, that I was like devoting 110% of myself to a job that I didn't love, and that the only thing I ever wanted, I was just letting it fade away. And so I figured, I could live with spectacular crash and burn failure, but I wasn't going to be able to live with just a slow fade to black. Right. And so that's the moment in my life where I got really serious is like, as it turns out, there's only one thing you need to do to be a writer, and it's just write. You can stop talking about writing, stop thinking about writing, stop saying why you didn't write. You just sit down and write. And so I had started my first novel when I was still in college. I was 19 when I started that book. And then I got serious about that book because it had stayed with me all these years. And so I sat down and I just, from that point forward, it was like a year and a half to finish that first book. So I started it when I was 19. I finished it when I was 29.
So there's hope for the rest of us.
It's 10 years, but it was the first book that I sold. And that was that first book that I wrote that was eventually published. And I think that all my years in publishing, like, it didn't actually help me get published, but it helped me understand the business in a way that I never would have understood it. And it also, you know, just sort of gave me permission, I think, to be what I was, because after all those years of working in publishing, there's an entire industry around people who are creating and writing and, you know, bringing story to life. So it's an entire industry. So obviously, if other people could do it, then I could also do it. So it gave me the permission that I did not have early on as a creative.
Sure, and that's a really interesting point, because there really is that, you know, a lot of people think that, oh, well, you've worked in the industry, so of course you're going to be successful because you have ins and contacts and you know how it works. But on the other hand, one, it's a very, you know, time-consuming
Yeah.
job, like you
Yeah.
mentioned, but also, you know, you sort of maybe lose the idealism because you realize that success isn't easy to achieve, and that there are a lot
Yeah.
of manuscripts in the slush pile that will never be seen. And I know a lot of people too who were really discouraged by that, because they knew the realities of, you know, you see this many manuscripts and this is the one that gets, you know, picked up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
But I just want to ask you like maybe two more questions for you, and then I'll let you get back to it, because obviously you have deadlines now that you're giving us novels and short stories every year, which
Yeah,
is
exactly.
but I did want to ask, when it comes to your books, you know, and categorization is huge in the industry because people have to know how to find a book. And of course, having worked in the
Right.
industry, you know, I'm sure you have thoughts on that. But the only thing that people can really agree upon when it comes to your books in terms of categorization is that they're not easily categorized. Um,
I know. That's the problem.
I know, right? Because, you know, it's a thriller, but it's literary. It's this, it's that. How do you see your books? If you had to describe your books to somebody who hasn't read them, what would you say?
That's a hard question. I mean, because I never, you know, it's so, the process for me is so, like, I'm so entrenched in the process of writing, right? You know, for me, it really, everything does start like maybe with, there's a germ, you know, like some idea or a thought or something I read or something I see. It leads to a bunch of research, and then the best way I can describe it is if it connects with something else that's going on with me, I start hearing a voice or voices, and I follow those voices through the manuscript. And, you know, I sit down day to day and I just have this kind of nebulous idea of what's happening, and I don't know who's going to show up day to day. I don't know what's going to happen. I certainly don't know how the book is going to end. Not even totally sure what it's about until it's complete. So then to try to categorize that on top of it is very challenging. I guess that if I had to come up with a category for my books, I would say that it's character-driven psychological suspense. But it's mainly, you know, every book for me is a question that I have about the human psyche. Like, this is my like overriding curiosity. This is the ongoing exploration of my life. It's like, you know, the you know, brain science, psychiatry / psychology, and the mystical. What makes us who we are, what, you know, what turns one person into a killer, what turns one person into a hero, why is there so little black and white like that? Everything to me sort of appears in shades of gray. And when it comes to the human mind and the human psyche, like, as I see it, there are more questions than there are answers. So it bears like sort of endless exploration. And so that's kind of what I'm doing in my fiction. And, you know, I don't know how to categorize it any other any other way.
So basically, bookstores just need to have like a Lisa Unger shelf, and then
That's what I think.
one-stop
Right. That's the
shopping.
thing. It's like, if you get, right, just go looking for Lisa Unger and you will find her shelf. And that's, you know, what it is. And the books are, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, kind of the recipe is, you know, you give your reader what they want exactly the same every single time. And, you know, I am giving my reader that. Like my sort of longtime reader knows that, you know, when you open up the book, it's not going to be what came before it. But, you know, there are certain
Yeah.
threads and themes that come through that I think you would find through the body of work. There is you know, there are common themes and common threads. And in some cases, you know, there are characters that appear and disappear. There's a fictional town that if the book is not about, you know, the Hollows, then the Hollows is trying to get into that book. So for people who have been reading me since, you know, the beginning, there's a whole like sort of universe of things that are, you know, consistent for them.
Sure, and it's funny because I talk about this a lot, but it's sort of that it's the same but different, and you may not be able to define it, but as a reader and as a writer, you know you know it when you see it, and you just have to have faith in that.
Exactly.
It's funny too. Last question for you in a moment, but the more I talk to you, the more I think, wow, I should have had you and Jeffrey Deaver on at the same time.
Oh yeah, I love him. He's so wonderful.
He's great. And I talked to him earlier in the week, and just a couple of things that you said, you know, reminded me of that conversation. Because one, you talked about how, you know, your books are always very character driven and plot comes second. Whereas he'll say that, you know, it's always about plot for him. And only recently has he really begun to work on the character development. And now they've become a little bit more primary in his stories. But
Yeah.
he also says, you know, he is a plotter and not a pantser because he can't imagine, you know, writing the books without knowing exactly where it's going, and worrying about, you know, if he misses something or wastes time or is telling the wrong story. And then there's you, who you sit down and you hear the voices and they let them direct you where they need to go. So it's just sort of two extreme opposites, but you both write incredible books. So you probably have a real fun conversation. I'm sure you have.
I'm sure we would. Yeah, I'm sure. And I do actually really enjoy that conversation too. You know, like it's always like plotters versus pantsers, which I absolutely hate. I hate that. Like I really think of it more as like you're a gardener. Like there's a seed that you've planted and that it's going to grow, and that you take care of it as it grows, and that you have, like, every novel is kind of an act of faith, you know, especially for somebody who's been writing since they were a kid, and you kind of, I think in many ways have like sort of internalized the form of the novel. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about this since you know, it came up in a couple of different chats I had with authors. You know, it usually does come up because it's two very distinct camps. You know, there's the plotters and there's the gardeners, and you know, it comes up a lot, and I don't think there's any way to choose it. Like you just are the kind of writer that you are, right? Like that's just the way your brain works. And but I come to think, like, in considering this, that maybe it's not as different as you think. So like the outliner, the person who gets everything in order or whatever, you know, they're kind of creating a scaffolding, right? And whereas, you know, as the gardener or as the pantser, you're just taking longer to develop
Sure.
to develop the story. I mean, you're both developing a story. It's just like one person, it just takes a year as opposed to a week.
Right.
And if you write the way I write, which is like, you know, if it's like, you know, I'm writing, and then if I sort of run into, you know, a block, or basically like the stone wall of my own ignorance, whatever it happens to be, like I'm going to get up and walk away and go exercise. And I'm not going to, like, I'm not one of those people that's like, I'm going to put this down no matter what. Like that's never going to happen, right? Like I'm going to wait until I feel that jolt, you know, that energy, or that hear that voice, or see that next thing that needs to be on the page. And I'm going to wait for that and not write until that comes. And so usually for me, that means, you know, a couple of hours, like, you know, whatever. And so that's my process. That's how it works for me.
Sure, no, that's great, and it's funny because there is that divide between the philosophies, but really it is all about cultivating stories, which I think you just kind of pointed out. Regardless of how you do it, you know, there's there's a process.
It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It's almost like it's just a different, like, some people need to have that plot structure.
Right.
Some people need to have that. And some people, for me, like if I knew how the book was going to end, I wouldn't even be able to write it. I'd be like, why? I write for the same reason that I read, because I want to know what's going to happen to these people living in my head. So, I mean, if I already know, why spend a whole year writing that story?
I always figure, if you're surprised as the writer, there's probably a better
Right.
chance that as the reader, I'm going to be surprised. But
Hope so. I'm always surprised.
So I will ask you one more question, and then I will let you get back to it, because I know right off the side there's somebody type. You can't see them, but they're there.
Get back to it.
But my last question for you is, so you have a new book out in October, which is very exciting, Confessions on the 745. So can you just leave us with a little teaser of that?
Yeah, so Confessions on the 745 comes out October 6th, and it's very loosely based on the idea of the stranger on the train. So there's a young woman, she's had a horrible day. All she wants to do is get home and figure out how she's going to manage the mess of her life. And while she's on this train, the power goes out and the train stalls on the tracks. And she's next to a beautiful young woman who strikes up a conversation with her with a confession. And she's not sure whether it's the drink that she had that she shouldn't have had, or the dark of the train, or just the energy of this woman. But she too winds up confessing her most guarded secret to this total stranger. And the train comes back to life, and it's taking her back to her home, and she is sort of like, oh my God, why did I tell this person this secret thing about myself? And she becomes very awkward. They move apart, and she really hopes that she is never going to see this woman again. But she
who wouldn't want to read that book?
Right?
Yeah. You gotta wait 3 months. But I guess the good news is, in the meantime, you can check out Lisa Unger's short story, Let Her Be.
There's something to hold you over. Yeah.
Hold you over until October. So, Lisa Unger, you are delightful. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Sean. So much fun.
That was great. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.